Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. With the presidential election just weeks away, South Korea's conservative bloc has hit a critical impasse. Hopes for a unified conservative candidacy collapsed this week after two high-stakes meetings between Kim Moon-soo, the newly nominated People Power Party candidate, and independent contender Han Duck-soo ended in failure. Despite growing pressure from party leadership and the looming May 11th registration deadline, the two failed to reconcile their differences going forward. Now, this breakdown not only clouds the conservative strategy, but also injects fresh uncertainty into an already volatile race. Meanwhile, the opposition's Lee Jae-myung continues to poll strongly, even in head-to-head matchups. For a closer look at the situation, we invite Song Se-ryun, professor of law at Kyunghee University. Welcome.
Well, thank you. Happy to join you.
And also joining us is Lee Hyun, dean and professor of law at Handong International Law School. Great to see you, professor.
Always a pleasure to be with you.
Let's start right away with Professor Song. So, like I've said, the unification of the broader conservative bloc, which has seemed to gain momentum following Kim Moon-soo's nomination as the PPP's presidential candidate, has hit a stalemate after independent preliminary candidate Han Duck-soo, who's the former acting president, stepped in. Now, despite meetings in the past few days, the two sides failed to reach an agreement on unification. What are your thoughts on the outcome of those meetings?
I'm sure I'm not the only one thinking it's tiring and fatiguing to watch what's happening on the PP side. It's painful to watch geriatric politicians with a variety of antics. We saw backstabbing, power-mongering, being egotistical, and generally being very petty. I was thinking little kids in the playground would probably have better squabbles. Kids at least know how to play together. What's missing in this kind of chaotic situation is any glimpse of vision for what kind of conservative vision they can present to Korea. The complete lack of policy vision from the PP and the candidate side is kind of symptomatic of what's happening. My thought on the outcome of the meeting, it doesn't matter. They're unelectable anyways, in my mind, coming from a party that sided with the impeached an incompetent president. So whatever happening is not very consequential. But I think that what's happening there is adding insult to the injury, and probably the voters will have a clear picture of what the state of being is in the conservative side. Of course, the other side is no better, but I'm just focusing on the PP side.
Mm-hmm. But what about Professor Lee? You know, we have been aware that Kim Moon-soo was among the most proactive about, candidate unification during the party primary. What do you think is the background behind this shift in stance against the unification now?
Well, I think initially when there was talk of unification and when he was proposing this idea, I think he was assuming that if he won the primary and became the candidate for the PPP, then the talk of unification would be leaning towards him as far as becoming the sole candidate for the party. But I think as he's sort of now navigating the situation with respect to his candidacy, it's clear that the party elites or the party bosses here don't want him because the opinion polling is suggesting that if he goes head-to-head with Lee Jae-myung, he will be blown out, and that Han has maybe a better chance in the election. But be that as it may, I think the sense that as Professor Song was mentioning here, it seems pretty clear that at least it seems like an overwhelming lead that Lee Jae-myung could be most likely the next president. That maybe this issue about whether he will oppose unification, this is a candidate Kim, is really not about this election, but really the direction of the party going forward after the election, assuming, of course, that the PPP loses the election. So therefore, if he is the sole candidate, then he will have more influence on the party necessarily once I think the dust settles on this election. So, there's this issue within the party about the pro-Yoon faction, which I think, people are interpreting here as putting up Han as a candidate. But, Kim, in this case, wants to establish himself as maybe a party leader going forward, because we're not talking about just this election, but of course going forward, in future elections where after the president is elected, then he can have a better influence on the candidates that he would like to pursue with respect to the party's direction in the future. So I think what's going on here is maybe this is not the real fight that's going on in terms of the current election, but really the direction of the party going forward.
Right, so a lot of calculation, not only looking at the current situation, but also moving forward. Now, to resolve this, current stalemate, the People Power Party leadership has laid out a unification roadmap, proposing a debate, followed by public polling to, determine the final candidate. But Kim Moon-soo's camp has, flatly rejected this plan. Professor Lee, what impact do you think this conflict between the party leadership and the candidate Kim have on the upcoming election?
Well, it doesn't obviously not good for the party, because if they can't unify and they're not seen as being unifying against with one candidate against Lee Jae-myung in this election, I think people are going to tire of sort of what's going on in the party, and you really risk, I mean, a lot in this case in terms of the moderate voters who are really going to be the swing voters in this election. Because, I mean, given the factionalization and the deep divisions in the Korean electorate at this point, a lot of people have, of course, made up their minds as to, who they will choose. But, if there are swing voters or moderates here that maybe haven't decided, the fact that this is internal strife within the party, again, is not a good sign for the party in terms of trying to rally a group of people who are undecided towards their side, because it looks like they can't get their act together. This infighting really is not portrays a unified vision and image for the party. So I think the ultimate result of this, if they continue with this and this continues on with legal battles and comments made in the media about the inadequacies of the candidate, then I don't think the future looks very bright in terms of this election for the party if this continues.
Of course, this kind of internal tug of war doesn't just stay behind closed doors. It risks undermining voter confidence, when the party should be actually consolidating. Now, meanwhile, former acting president Han Duck-soo has declared that, if a unified candidacy is not achieved by the registration deadline by May 11th, he will not register as a candidate. Professor Song, how should we interpret his, very bold statement?
Well, I think his intention was to give an ultimatum to facilitate the process if it's going to happen at all. But to many voters, it sounded as if he was not very serious about running for presidency. So from a communication point of view, it's not a very polished message. His platform is that he can promise stability while Korea has a time to sort things out, and him playing the extended caretaker and getting the constitutional reform done, amendment done, and focusing on the economy. I think that he can promise that out of his many decades of experience in the government, he can provide a stable hands. But as a presidential candidate, I don't know if it's inspirational enough and persuasive enough to get him over the electable position. So it's a very precarious situation. I think it comes from the fact that he has not been the politician per se, but a technocrat, a capable technocrat, to give him credit for many years. So I think the focus is stopping Mr. Lee Jae-myung from being a president, as he describes it as a horrible scenario. But in terms of strategic positioning, he has to put on a very credible presidential platform. But it seems like his lack of experience and probably bad advices from around is not making it happening. And the Mr. Kim Moon-soo kind of holding on to his the position as a party candidate is making things very, very difficult at this point.
Right. So, though it may seem, his intention was to give a final warning shot, how it resonated could be a little bit different. Now, just hours ago, Professor Lee, the court has dismissed both injunction requests filed by Kim Moon-soo, one seeking to affirm his status as the official candidate, and another to block the convening of the PPP's National Committee and Party Congress. What's the reasoning, do you think, behind the court's decision? And what about the possibilities of, replacing the party's candidate?
Well, this is really a question of interpreting the Constitution for the party, because this centers on Article 74 of the party's Constitution that basically gives a lot of authority to the presidential candidate who's been selected by the party. That's candidate Kim Moon-soo in this case. But there is a provision in that same article that potentially may limit the candidate who's been selected in terms of the election itself. So while the constitution of the party gives a lot of authority to the candidate in terms of deciding how the campaigning will be run, have widespread sort of authority with respect to the election itself and the campaign, but the interpretation that was given by the party is that there's potential limitations on the candidate's ability to then, let's say, call for, let's say, a convention if in case the candidate needs to be replaced. And so there's the proviso in the Constitution that allows for maybe the party to sort of make a decision to have, a replacement candidate. And so the court here was really interpreting that particular article and then saying whether or not an injunction was necessary, because the court's view at the time and today basically saying that there was no necessary immediate sort of decision made by the party to remove him. So there was really no harm to the candidate himself. And so they would be premature. But also, furthermore, that the court would not really want to step into the autonomy of the party in deciding its internal workings and its rules with respect to candidate selection. So I think what the court was doing was taking a more hands-off approach, because this is not a matter of public, concern necessarily in terms of the government, but the political party making its own decisions as to how the candidate will be selected. And so I think that's where the court came down. But in terms of the ramifications of this, if in this case, if they go forward with this issue with respect to the candidate, then I think, it would be catastrophic for the party at some level, because candidate Kim, of course, was selected through a kind of a democratic process. And if it's seen that the party bosses or the elites in this case don't like him, don't want him for whatever reason, that sort of undermines sort of the process that was taking place in the party. And therefore, those people who are supporting candidate Kim, I think, may decide that they want to sit out this election. So this really is not a good position to be in if you're the party, this kind of situation where they potentially may move forward, which I think in all likelihood looks like that they're going to move forward with a selection process. They may, in fact, want to replace him. So I think in the end, it just is not good for the party, because I think catastrophe for them if they decide to go forward and replace him.
Right, of course, it would really reset the whole race if, they have to revisit the situation. Now, let's also touch upon the other party, the Democratic Party, Lee Jae-myung's side. Now, according to a recent Gallup Korea poll, Democratic Party candidate Lee Jae-myung is leading a hypothetical matchup against a unified conservative candidate. Now, this is despite the Supreme Court returning his public election law violation case for review at the High Court. Now, Professor Lee, what do you make of this continued lead of the DP?
Well, I think it can be interpreted several different ways, but I think, with Lee Jae-myung, I mean, these kinds of scandals or the allegations of these scandals have been in the news for quite some time, and essentially has been litigated in the court of public opinion, essentially. And so therefore, like I said before, I think a lot of people have made up their minds already about Representative Lee in this case. And so whether you like him or you don't like him, I think those decisions were forged months ago. And so the fact that, the case had gone forward to the Supreme Court, I think potentially, of course, could sway moderate voters. And I think that's really the concern here for either party is, this middle ground, this middle group of people, are they going to be influenced by the decision of the Supreme Court? As far as it goes, given the Seoul High Court's decision to basically delay the sentencing or finding of guilt with respect to and punishment until after the election, I think that makes this all moot. Basically, at this point, unless if Lee doesn't win the election, then obviously this case will go forward against him potentially, and then he could be barred. But if he wins the election, then of course this really does not make a big difference in his case because that litigation will not go forward against him. So I think with respect to what has happened with the Supreme Court, I think there's the idea that he's already a known candidate, and therefore people have made those judgments. But also, I think there's a lot of view here that there's need for a change because the PPP had their chance and they kind of blew it with President Yoon. And so therefore the momentum is clearly shifted on the other side that maybe we need a fresh face with respect to the presidency.
Mm-hmm. Now, we've been touching upon Lee Jae-myung's, latest hearings. Professor Song, Lee Jae-myung's recent rehearing and the review of the verdict in his election law violations case has been postponed from May 15th to June 18th, which is after the presidential election. What about you? Professor Lee has mentioned about his opinion. What about you? How should we interpret the court's decision, and what kind of impact do you think it would have on the election?
Well, a lot of people try to think that the judiciary is playing a role in this political scene and trying to influence the elections. I differ in that opinion. Usually, the judiciary has a different agenda, different the schedules that they follow, and sometimes their paths cross so that their decisions influence politically and the political actions. But I don't think it was that conclusively. I thought that the Supreme Court decision was rendered as it had to be. They facilitated the schedule because that question is also important for the voters' mind. I think that's why they did that. And the postponing of the High Court sentencing, it's not strange either. For a lot of reasons, the defense attorneys and also the prosecutors apply and request the schedules be changed. And courts, if they don't have a particular urgency, they usually allow that to happen. So I think that people try to interpret the court's actions from a political standpoint, but more often than not, it's not. The court is doing what they are supposed to do, and I think that what's happening here is something that happens in three different branches of the government, doing different things from a different perspectives, which is perfectly normal. I think what is worrying is that having the legislative power, in this case, it happens to be the opposition party, trying to, threaten or being somebody to try to dominate the other branches of the government. So it's a question of a constitutional arrangement of three powers having checks and balances. I think that eroding in rhetorics and in actions, I think it's more a serious thing than I think that if Lee Jae-myung has a very big risk in his election is not because of the other party, but because his own party has a legislative power. And if he grabs the presidency, then executive power and their tendency to attack the judiciary is worrying for people that this one branch of the government is one party is trying to have all the power onto himself without the checks and balances. I think that's a structurally more important and more worrying situation than what court is doing currently.
Right. So as for now, the judiciary seem to have had their own standards in making their judgment. Now, before we conclude our discussion, Professor Lee, with just less than a month until Election Day, what kind of major variables do you think that remain could shake up the race?
Well, clearly, this weekend is going to be very indicative for the Conservative Party as far as the unification question. And so I think that's going to be a huge factor in terms of how this race eventually ends up. Because if the PPP basically continues its infighting and they can't coalesce against around a single unified candidate, one candidate, then this division is really going to fracture the party, and basically, the electorate is really not going to vote in favor of a party that can't get its act together. So I think that's going to be a huge factor. So we'll find out this weekend as to whether or not that will be the case, whether it's candidate Kim Moon-soo, or Han Duck-soo in this case. But the other thing is, since we have still several weeks away till the election, the policy proposals will now come into greater focus. Once the dust settles here in terms of who the actual candidates are, then I think people will hopefully be looking at the policies themselves and seeing what direction are the candidates pushing for the country in terms of, the economy, society, the aging population, the low birth rate, right? There's so many different issues Korea faces. And so I think that will hopefully come to focus here, that we talk about the policies and not just about the political infighting and the politics of what's going on. And I think lastly, too, another X factor potentially is, again, because Lee Jae-myung has had these different scandals that he's been so associated with, is there something else that's going to come up in the next several weeks? I think, again, even if I said that in the past, these issues have been laid out before him in terms of what he has been accused of, whether or not, there's going to be significant airtime in terms of, trying to air out these kinds of issues that he's faced in the past in terms of corruption potentially. So if that's not really sort of played out very much, if he's successfully been able to push that aside quite a bit, then I think he potentially has a relatively clear path to the presidency based on what we're seeing right now. Right.
So we would be able to get a clearer picture by next week regarding the unification for the PPP, and as for the DP, whether there would be more things that could be shaking the voters' decision. But ultimately, the most important thing would be the two parties' policies that would really be important for our daily lives. Now, we will have to conclude our discussion at this point, but thank you so much for your insights and for your time, Professors Hong and Professor Lee. We appreciate it so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Till then, stay informed and engaged.